We speak of consciousness and its degrees, of the will and its effects, of the thousand ways of moving the body, of dominating the body and the passions, but we do not even know what a body can do. Hello everyone, welcome to Flicker Theory Reviews. I'm your host, Taras Vinokur. Today I will talk about a book on Spinoza by Gilles Deleuze called Spinoza Practical Philosophy. Gilles Deleuze. It is a known fact that Gilles Deleuze had a lot of respect for Spinoza. In the book What is Philosophy, which he wrote together with his colleague and collaborator Felix Guattari, Deleuze referred to Spinoza as the Prince of Philosophy. Spinoza, according to Deleuze, was the philosopher who never compromised with transcendence. Instead, he hunted it down everywhere. What this means exactly will become more clear later in this review. One of the more valuable features of Deleuze's perspective towards Spinoza lies in Deleuze's capacity to reimagine, reinvent Spinoza's work. Deleuze saw Spinoza in a different light. He gave Spinoza a new life. The entire philosophical tradition shunned Spinoza as a pure metaphysician. Spinoza's metaphysics was considered amoral and atheological. Hegel, for example, considered Spinoza to be an author of purely theoretical system. Some other philosophers like Alexander Kojève thought that Spinoza's work excluded freedom, liberty, insofar as it excluded subjectivity. We also should not forget that during his life, Spinoza was also misunderstood to a great extent. Just think of the fact that Spinoza didn't manage to publish his book, Ethics, which took him 15 years to finish, during his lifetime, due to its unconventionality. So, as I said, Deleuze in this book sees Spinoza in a different light. He doesn't see Spinoza as a pure theoretician. In fact, for Deleuze, Spinoza is a philosopher of the force of life, of the triumph of joy over sadness. Deleuze himself said that for Spinoza, life is not an idea or something theoretical, perhaps. It's a matter of being, the same eternal manner in all of its aspects. Let's remember the main thesis of Spinoza's Ethics, which states that there is one substance, God or nature, and that everything that exists is merely a modulation of the substance. Why is Deleuze attracted to this idea? Well, it's because Spinoza rejects the transcendental world of phenomena and creates a plane of absolute immanence. Again, as Deleuze says, for Spinoza, life is not theoretical. It's a matter of being. Most importantly, this is an ontological proposition. The focus here is not on theory, rationalism, or transcendental idealism, but on the absolute immanence. The consciousness as a separate entity is only an illusion for both Deleuze and Spinoza. So, in the first chapter, Deleuze writes, "Actually, there is only one term, life, that encompasses thought, but conversely this term is encompassed only by thought. Not that life is in thinking, but only the thinker has a potent life, free of guilt and hatred, and only life explains the thinker." A lot of this book is focused on the necessity to obliterate the dogmas, beliefs, transcendental truths that may obstruct our ability to embrace the force of life. Here again, Deleuze is talking about the illusion of consciousness, which, instead of allowing us to think in an unfettered way, obstructs our ability to understand the immanence of life, free of guilt or hatred. The proper thinker, as Deleuze sees it, is able to realize the world as something that influences and affects our mind. He denounces all falsifications of life, all the values, man-made values, in the name of which we disparage the force of life. So we established already that for Spinoza, there's substance that possesses infinity of attributes. Deus sive natura, in Latin, which implies that all living creatures are only modes of these attributes. They're all modifications of this immanent substance. We know that this implies pantheism and a certain kind of even atheism. Here, however, Deleuze wants to say something practical. For him, it's not enough to just say that for Spinoza, nature equals God. He says we have to start from the practical theses that made Spinozism an object of scandal. Consequently, Deleuze begins by discussing Spinoza's denunciation of consciousness, of values, and of sad passions. Here, Deleuze also notes that Spinoza's denunciations of these three major notions resembles Nietzsche's philosophy. Firstly, Deleuze discusses Spinoza's alleged materialism, immoralism, and atheism. We talked a little bit about this already. Spinoza devalues the consciousness in favor of thought. This way, Spinoza lends himself to the materialist interpretation. Why? Because Spinoza offers philosophers a new model, the body. Spinoza writes, "We speak of consciousness and its degrees, of the will and its effects, of the thousand ways of moving the body, of dominating the body and the passions, but we do not even know what a body can do." Nietzsche also says something similar. We stand amazed before consciousness, but the truly surprising thing is rather the body. Again, this means that the mind is not free from the material reality. If anything, there's a certain kind of parallelism of body and the mind. They might just be parallel to each other. Well, why is body positioned as a model? Because it is a way of showing that the body surpasses the consciousness that we have of it. The body is there before consciousness thinks it. Sounds a little bit like the chicken and egg situation. Not only that, according to Deleuze, Spinoza understands thought as something that surpasses the consciousness that we have of it. In other words, Spinoza discovers the unconscious of thought and the unconscious of the body. Again, our consciousness is unaware of the procedures of the body. In addition, it is also unaware of the procedures of thought. Here, Deleuze quotes Nietzsche. "The greater activity is unconscious. Consciousness usually only appears when a whole wants to subordinate itself to a superior whole. It is primarily the consciousness of this superior whole, of reality external to the ego. Consciousness is born in relation to a being of which we could be a function. It is the means by which we incorporate into that being." Remember the Freudian metaphor of the iceberg? The unconscious is a greater activity than the consciousness. Consciousness is a mere shield that protects us from the vast immanence of unconscious. After discussing Spinoza's denunciation of consciousness, Deleuze goes on to discuss Spinoza the immoralist, who is manifested by his devaluation of values, most importantly of the good and evil. As to the question of morality, Spinoza gives the example of Adam, who faces God's prohibition. In Spinoza's view, this is not only a prohibition, it is also a reference to the fruit, which will poison Adam if he eats it. This is an instance of an encounter between two bodies whose characteristic relations are not compatible. That is to say, the fruit will act as a poison, or in the words of Deleuze, the fruit will determine the parts of Adam's body to enter into new relations that no longer accord with his own essence. Therefore, Deleuze states, according to Spinoza, evil is only a bad encounter, poisoning, or in other words, evil is just a case of relational decomposition. Two bodies encounter each other, poison and mouth, and they relationally decompose each other. Hence, there is no good or evil, says Deleuze. The good is when a body directly compounds its relation with ours and increases our power. This happens when we eat food, for example. We eat food and we feel better. The bad is when a body decomposes our body's relation. This way, Deleuze associates goodness with the human ability to organize encounters, our ability to join with relations that are compatible with ours carries our goodness. Moral law, for Deleuze, does not provide us with any kind of knowledge then. It makes nothing known. Hence, there is a practical confusion here. Spinoza would say that theology is something that constructs a law or a foundation. This foundation is often perceived as an imperative, and that is simply unfortunate. After all, you can't learn anything from the law. Hence, if knowledge as an immanent power can be preserved, the imperative or the law should be disavowed. The problem is simply that the command, moral or otherwise, is mistaken for something to be understood. This is a matter of obedience to the knowledge itself. If consciousness can be understood as passage from one encounter to the other, such obedience to the knowledge is merely a frivolous roadblock, a strict normalizing obstacle. Lastly, Deleuze discusses Spinoza's work as it devalued all the so-called sad passions in favor of joy. Spinoza, the atheist, is discussed here as well. Throughout his work, says Deleuze, Spinoza does not cease to denounce three kinds of personage: the man with sad passions, the man who exploits these sad passions, who needs them in order to establish his power, and the man who is saddened by the human condition and by human passions in general. In other words, Spinoza is talking about the slave, the tyrant, and the priest, the moralist trinity. What he's talking about is rather simple. Throughout the history, the supreme, sovereign power has exploited the subjects by masking their fear that actually commands them around, by erecting things like religion. So the men fight as bravely for slavery as for safety. Before you know, people counted the highest honor to risk their blood and lives for the tyrant. Similarly, in Spinoza's Ethics, a portrait of the resentful man is drawn, for whom all happiness is an offense. Such a man, again, is a constituent unit of the moralist trinity. Such a man is overwhelmed by the zeal of religion and impatience of mind. Such a man prefers to live among the lower animals rather than among men. Spinoza says, "They are like boys or young men who cannot bear calmly the scolding of their parents and take refuge in the army." Here, Deleuze finds the philosophy of life in Spinoza, which consists in denouncing all that separates us from life, all these transcendent values that are turned against life, like transcendental ideals, theological laws, or sad passions. Life is poisoned by the categories of good and evil, of blame and merit, of sin and redemption. I should emphasize also that Spinoza did this before Nietzsche was there. He denounced all the falsifications of life like sadness, hatred, aversion, mockery, fear, despair, pity, and many others. Spinoza denounced the values that disparage life. All in all, both Deleuze and Spinoza call us to embrace the force of life, denounce cultural bigotry and transcendental prejudice. This way, Deleuze ties this book to his later one, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, which he wrote together with Felix Guattari. Most importantly, Deleuze wants to ask the question, namely, what are the mental illusions that falsify life? We should stop living within the semblance of life. We should stop worshiping death. We should instead embrace the unconscious. Thank you. See you next time.